On July 14th, Mara Voss walked into the bathroom of room 214 at the Ether Suites in Oya, Santorini, and did not walk out. Her phone was on the nightstand. Her passport was in the safe. Her wedding ring, a thin gold band she'd picked out herself because she didn't like diamonds, was sitting on the edge of the sink next to a glass of water she'd poured but never drank. The bathroom window was open. Below it, a 60-meter drop into the Aegean. She'd been married for 11 days. Her husband Daniel was on the terrace when it happened, or when he says it happened.
I'm Lukas, and this is Lost Files. We tell the stories that mainstream media ignores. The disappearances, the mysteries, the cases that deserve more attention. If you know a story that needs to be heard, drop it in the form linked below. And if this one stuck with you, subscribe and let me know your thoughts in the comments.
He told police he'd been watching the lights of a distant ferry cross the caldera, drinking the last of a bottle of Assyrtiko they'd opened at dinner. He said he heard nothing. No scream, no splash, no struggle. He said he assumed she was showering. He said 20 minutes passed before he knocked on the door. He said another 5 before he opened it. He said the window was already open when he found the room empty. He said the curtain was moving in the wind. He said he screamed her name into the dark. Maybe he did. Maybe the caldera swallowed the sound the way it swallows everything, boats, voices, centuries of volcanic ash. Or maybe the terrace was quiet that night, and the only performance was the one Daniel Voss was already rehearsing. To understand what happened to Mara Voss, you have to understand where she came from, not Santorini, before that, before Daniel, before the wedding and the dress, and the 11 days of photographed happiness that would later be examined frame by investigators on 2 continents. Mara Tsiobanu grew up in Florești, a town of 14,000 people in central Moldova, a country most Americans couldn't locate on a map, wedged between Romania and Ukraine, one of the poorest nations in Europe. Her father drove a delivery truck for a bottling company. Her mother worked at a textile factory until it closed, then cleaned houses. They lived in a Soviet-era apartment block with radiators that clanked all winter and windows that didn't seal properly. Mara was the middle child, an older brother who'd left for construction work in Portugal when she was 15, a younger sister still in school. She was bright in the way that teachers notice and economies waste. She spoke 4 languages by the time she was 20, Romanian, Russian, English, and French, learned partly in school, partly from subtitled films she watched on a secondhand laptop, partly from a stubborn refusal to accept that Florești was the entire world. She studied linguistics at the State University in Chisinau. She taught English at a private language center for 2 years, making the equivalent of €300 a month. She was good at it. Her students remembered her because she made them speak from the first lesson. No grammar drills, no conjugation tables, just talk. Tell me about your morning. Describe your mother's kitchen. What do you dream about? She believed language was an act of identity, that the words you chose revealed who you were trying to become. She had a small life, a rented room, a cat she'd found behind the university, a circle of friends who met on Fridays at a cafe that served bad coffee and good conversation. She dated occasionally without much enthusiasm. She sent money home. She wanted more, not wealth, not glamour, just scope, a wider life. A life where speaking 4 languages meant something beyond tutoring businessmen in a cramped office on the 3rd floor of a building with no elevator. She met Daniel Voss on a language exchange app in March of 2021. He was charming. Of course he was charming. That's what people say afterward, and it always sounds like an accusation, as if charm were something you should have seen through, as if warmth and attentiveness were warning signs. Daniel presented himself as a Swedish-American architect living in Copenhagen, 36, divorced, amicably, no children. He spoke 3 languages himself, English, Swedish, and passable German, and he was learning Romanian, he said, because he'd become fascinated with Eastern European design traditions, the way Soviet brutalism intersected with older folk aesthetics. It was a good story, specific enough to be believable, flattering enough to make Mara feel seen, her country, her language, treated not as a curiosity or a punchline, but as something worthy of serious attention. He asked questions about Moldova with genuine seeming interest. He remembered details she mentioned weeks earlier. He sent her articles about Romanian architecture, links to films by Moldovan directors she hadn't seen, photographs of buildings in Copenhagen that reminded him of things she'd described. The courtship lasted 14 months. 14 months of messages, video calls, shared playlists, and the slow, deliberate construction of trust. He visited Chisinau twice, the first time 3 days. They walked along the lake in Valea Moralor. He brought her cat a toy from a shop in the airport. He met 2 of her friends and was, they later said, effortlessly likable. Funny, self-deprecating, interested in everyone. The second visit was a week. He met her parents. He spoke his broken Romanian, and her father laughed and corrected his pronunciation and opened a bottle of homemade wine. Her mother watched him carefully. She told Mara later that something bothered her, though she couldn't name what. "He's very smooth," she said, "like a stone in a river, no edges." Mara dismissed it. Mothers worry. That's what mothers do. Daniel proposed in October of 2022 during a video call. He held up a ring, that thin gold band, and asked her in Romanian. His accent was terrible and sincere. She said yes. She cried. She called her mother, who cried too, though whether from joy or that unnamed unease, no one ever asked. They married in Copenhagen in June of 2023, a small ceremony. Daniel said his family was scattered and largely estranged, which Mara accepted because her own brother hadn't come home from Lisbon in 4 years. Her parents couldn't afford the trip. Her younger sister, Alina, came and served as the only witness from Mara's life. Alina would later tell investigators that the wedding felt like a photograph of a wedding. Beautiful, precise, and somehow flat. Everyone smiled, she said, but there was no mess, no drunk uncle, no crying grandmother. It was just clean, like he'd designed it. She paused, then added, "I guess he had." The honeymoon was Daniel's idea. Santorini, he said, because he'd always wanted to see the architecture, the way the buildings cascaded down the cliffside white against the volcanic rock, a place where human construction and geological catastrophe had merged into something beautiful. Mara had never left Eastern Europe. The flight to Athens, the ferry to Santorini, the van ride along the narrow road to Oia, it was the widest her world had ever been. Photographs from those first days show a woman incandescent with wonder. Mara standing at the edge of the caldera, wind in her hair, mouth open in what looks like laughter or disbelief. Mara at a restaurant table, a plate of grilled octopus in front of her, holding up her wine glass toward the camera, toward Daniel, who took almost every photo. Mara on a donkey path, wearing a sundress she'd bought in Athens, squinting against the light. She looks happy, genuinely, radiantly happy. And maybe she was. That's the thing about predators who operate over months and years. The happiness isn't fake. The love, from the victim's side, is real. The experience is real. The betrayal doesn't erase it. It contaminates it, retroactively poisons every genuine moment until the person can no longer trust their own memory. What was real? What was engineered? What was... Mara would spend years trying to answer that question. She never fully could. The evening of July 14th was warm, 28 degrees, a light wind from the north. Daniel and Mara had dinner at Anamomelos, a cliffside restaurant in Oia known for its sunset views. They arrived at 8. They shared a bottle of wine, the Assyrtiko, and ordered sea bass and lamb. The waiter remembered them because Mara complimented his English and because she asked him to teach her a Greek phrase. Efcharisto poli, she practiced, getting the stress wrong, laughing at herself. Thank you very much. The waiter corrected her pronunciation. She tried again, got it right, and clapped her hands like a child who'd solved a puzzle. She was so alive, the waiter told a reporter months later. That's what I remember. She was so completely alive. They left the restaurant around 10:30. Surveillance footage, grainy, partial, from a camera mounted on a jewelry shop across the lane, shows them walking toward their hotel. Daniel's arm is around Mara's shoulders. She's leaning into him. At one point she stops, turns, and says something to him. He laughs. She punches his arm lightly. They keep walking. This is the last footage of Mara Voss as a free woman. Room 214 of the Ether Suites was a cliffside suite with a private terrace overlooking the caldera. The bathroom had a single window, arched, without a screen, roughly 70 centimeters wide. Below it, the cliff face dropped steeply to the water. There was no balcony, no ledge, no foothold. If someone went through that window, they would fall. Daniel called the front desk at 11:07 p.m. The night manager, a woman named Despina Katsaru, answered. "Window is open. She's not here. Please, window is open. She's not here. Please, please help me." Despina sent a porter to the room and called the police. The porter arrived first. He found Daniel standing on the terrace, gripping the railing, staring down at the dark water. The bathroom was empty. The window was wide open. The wedding ring sat on the sink. The porter looked at the ring, then at Daniel. "Did she take anything?" he asked. "Nothing," Daniel said. "She didn't take anything. She just went to brush her teeth." The local police arrived within 20 minutes. 2 officers from the Oya station, followed shortly by a detective from Fira. They searched the room, finding no signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle, no blood, no drag marks, no anomalies beyond the open window and the absent woman. They searched the grounds of the hotel. They sent a patrol boat along the base of the cliff. They found nothing. By 2 a.m., the Hellenic Coast Guard had been notified. By dawn, a search and rescue operation was underway. Boats in the caldera, divers along the cliff base, a helicopter making sweeps over the water. Daniel Voss sat in the hotel lobby, wrapped in a blanket someone had given him, answering questions with the dazed compliance of a man in shock. He gave a detailed timeline. He described the evening. He explained that Mara sometimes opened windows because she liked fresh air, that she'd grown up in apartments with poor ventilation and had a habit of throwing open whatever she could. He mentioned that she'd had 2 glasses of wine, maybe 3. He mentioned the narrow window ledge. He was building a narrative. He was doing it so naturally that no one in the room recognized it as construction. The story he was telling. His wife, slightly tipsy, opened the bathroom window to let in the night air. She leaned out, perhaps to look at the stars reflected in the caldera. She lost her balance. She fell. A tragedy. An accident. The kind of thing that happens in places built on cliffs where the beauty is inseparable from the danger. It was a plausible story. That was the craft of it. Not airtight, no fabricated story is, but plausible enough that a police force accustomed to tourist accidents, drunk falls, and swimming mishaps could accept it as the most likely explanation and proceed accordingly. And they did. The search lasted 9 days. They found no body. The caldera is deep, nearly 400 meters in places, with strong currents that could carry a body far from the point of entry. It was not uncommon for drowning victims to go unrecovered. The absence of remains was not in itself suspicious. Daniel did everything a grieving husband should do. He cooperated with police. He gave interviews to Greek media, then international outlets as the story gained traction. The missing bride, the Santorini honeymoon, the open window. He cried on camera. His tears looked real. Maybe they were. Psychologists who later reviewed the footage disagreed on whether his emotion was performed or genuine, and concluded unsettlingly that for someone like Daniel, the distinction might not exist. He may have genuinely felt grief, not for Mara, for the disruption, the logistical inconvenience, the flaw in an otherwise clean operation. He appealed for information. He set up a social media page, Find Mara Voss, that accumulated 40,000 followers in a week. He shared photographs of their wedding, their honeymoon, their life together. He wrote posts that were raw, poetic, carefully imperfect. "I keep her toothbrush by the sink. I know that's crazy, I know. But I can't move it. If I move it, it means she's really gone. The internet responded with an outpouring of sympathy. Donations poured in for the search fund. Strangers sent messages of support. Women posted crying selfies captioned "Praying for Mara." True crime forums dissected the case, mostly concluding that Daniel was innocent. He was too visible, too emotional, too cooperative to be hiding something. A smaller, more skeptical faction pointed out that the ring on the sink was unusual, that a woman doesn't remove her wedding ring to brush her teeth, that the window was narrow enough to require effort to climb through, that Daniel's timeline had a 25-minute gap he couldn't fully account for. These voices were drowned out. Grief performed well enough, functions as its own alibi. People want to believe in the grieving husband because the alternative, that love itself can be a weapon, that intimacy can be a trap, that the person beside you in bed is someone you've never met, is too destabilizing to accept. So they believed Daniel Voss. Almost everyone did. The case faded. By August, it had dropped from the international news cycle, replaced by other tragedies, other disappearances, other photogenic losses. The Greek police maintained an open file. The Coast Guard suspended active searching. Daniel returned to Copenhagen, or wherever he went when he left Santorini, because investigators would later discover that the Copenhagen apartment listed as his residence had been rented under a name that didn't exist 6 years prior. Mara's parents waited and flourished. Her mother stopped sleeping through the night. Her father drove to the Moldovan embassy in Athens twice, both times returning with nothing. Sympathetic words, a case number, promises that the Greek authorities were doing everything they could. Her sister Alina, back in Chisinau, checked the Find Mara Voss page every morning, scrolling through strangers' prayers and conspiracy theories and the occasional cruel message suggesting Mara had run off with another man. Alina didn't believe the open window. She'd told investigators this during her interview in Copenhagen, told them that Mara was afraid of heights, that she'd been afraid of heights since childhood, since a fall from a balcony railing in their apartment building that had broken her arm at age 7, that Mara would not have leaned out of a window above a cliff, that she would not have opened that window at all. The investigator noted this. It went into the file. It did not change the trajectory of the case. And 800 kilometers to the southeast, in a dry stone chamber beneath the streets of Heraklion, Crete, a chamber that had been built 3 centuries ago to store rainwater and had been sealed and forgotten for decades, Mara Voss was alive. She was sitting on a wooden chair. She was wearing a white dress she had never chosen. And she was counting. Not days. She'd lost track of days long ago. She counted breaths. Inhale, hold, exhale, inhale, hold, exhale. A rhythm she'd taught herself in the first week, when the dark was so complete that she couldn't see her own hands and the silence was so total that she'd begun to hear sounds that weren't there. Dripping, scratching, a voice that sounded like Daniel saying her name. She counted, because counting was something she controlled. They could take the light. They could take the sound. They could take the dress off her body and replace it with another one while she slept. And she would wake wearing proof that she was theirs, that her choices had been overwritten. But they could not take the counting. They could not enter the space between one breath and the next. That space was hers. It was the only thing that was still hers. And she held onto it the way she'd once held onto the thin gold ring that now sat in an evidence bag in a police station on an island she might never see again. Inhale, hold, exhale. She was still there, diminished, disoriented, malnourished to the point where her body had begun consuming itself, but still there, still Mara, still counting, still refusing. Petros Manoudakis was 22 years old and had never left Crete. He'd grown up in a village south of Heraklion, the youngest of 4 brothers, the only one who hadn't gone into fishing or the merchant marine. He was slight, quiet, anxious, a young man who seemed perpetually startled by the world, as if every room he entered was louder than expected. He'd dropped out of technical school at 19. He worked odd jobs, construction, delivery driving, warehouse stocking. He drank too much on weekends and too little water during the week. He owed money to a cousin who'd lent him funds for a motorcycle he'd crashed within a month. He was recruited, though that's too formal a word, by a man he knew only as Kyrios Nikos, Mr. Nikos, a 60-something Athenian who owned rental properties in Heraklion and occasionally hired young men for off-the-books maintenance work. Cash in hand, no questions. The kind of arrangement common enough in Crete that it raised no alarms. The work started simple. Delivering supplies to properties, changing locks, clearing out apartments between tenants. Then, in early 2023, Mr. Nikos asked Petros if he could keep a secret. Not a don't tell your friends secret, a real one, the kind you carry. Petros said yes because Mr. Nikos was offering 500 euros a week, and because Petros owed his cousin 3,000, and because at 22 keeping a secret sounds manageable. It sounds like something adults do. He was told about the chamber beneath the old town, told it was being used to house a woman who was in a private arrangement, a foreigner. A willing participant in something Petros was better off not fully understanding. His job was simple. Bring food and water twice a day, check the padlock, report any problems to a phone number that changed monthly. Don't talk to her, Mr. Nikos told him. She'll try, they always try, just leave the tray and go. For the first 3 weeks, Petros followed instructions. He unlocked the iron door, descended the narrow stone steps, left the tray on the floor of the chamber, and left. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak. He heard her voice, sometimes asking questions, sometimes pleading, sometimes just saying words in languages he didn't understand, as if practicing, as if reminding herself that she could still speak. He tried not to hear. He tried to think about the money, about the debt, about the motorcycle he'd replace someday, but the voice followed him up the stairs. It followed him home. It followed him into sleep. By the second month, he was looking at her. By the third, he was listening. She spoke to him in English first, then Greek, fragments, broken but determined. She told him her name. She told him she was married. She told him she had a sister. Please, she said, I know you're not a bad person. I can hear it. The way you set down the tray, you're careful. You don't want to scare me. A bad person wouldn't care. Petros set down the tray and left. He sat in his car for 40 minutes, forehead against the steering wheel, breathing the way she breathed. In, hold, out. In, hold, out. He didn't go to the police. He didn't call anyone. He was afraid, and the fear was not abstract. Mr. Nikos had explained casually, almost as an afterthought, what happened to people who talked. The explanation involved a specific story about a specific person who had talked and was no longer a person anyone could find. But Petros Manoudakis, who had never been brave, who had never been anything in particular, who had drifted through 22 years of small failures and smaller ambitions, Petros went to church. He went to Agios Minas, the cathedral in Heraklion, on a Tuesday afternoon in February. He hadn't been to confession in years. He didn't know the priest, an elderly man named Father Ioannis Stavridis, 71 years old, who had been hearing confessions at Agios Minas for 3 decades and had long since stopped being surprised by anything. Until that Tuesday. What Petros said in that confessional is protected by the seal of confession, one of the most absolute confidentialities in Western civilization. Father Stavridis would never repeat it, not to police, not to journalists, not to anyone. But here is what is known. Petros left the cathedral visibly shaken. Father Stavridis remained in the confessional for nearly an hour after Petros departed. When he emerged, the sacristan noticed his hands were trembling. 2 days later, an anonymous call was placed to the Heraklion Municipal Water Authority. The caller, male, elderly, speaking formal Greek, reported a concern about a sealed cistern beneath the old town. He mentioned a specific location. He said nothing about a woman, nothing about captivity, nothing about crime. He said only that something is wrong underground and that someone should look. The call was logged. It was assigned a low priority. Cistern maintenance was unglamorous, underfunded work, and a vague complaint from an anonymous caller didn't compete with burst mains and sewage overflows. The work order sat in a queue for 6 weeks. And below the streets of Heraklion, in a stone chamber that smelled of damp and old iron, Mara Voss kept counting. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. She didn't know anyone was coming. She didn't know the priest had called. She didn't know the work order existed or that it was sitting 23rd in a queue of 31, slowly moving toward the top. She only knew what she had known for months, that the dark was complete, that the silence was nearly total, that a young man with frightened eyes brought food she could barely eat, and that somewhere above her the world was continuing without her. Her mother checking her phone, her sister scrolling through strangers' prayers, her father driving to embassies that had nothing to give him. She knew one other thing, though she couldn't have articulated it. She knew she had not agreed. The dress they had put on her body while she slept was not her dress. The ceremony they had planned was not her ceremony. The name they intended to give her was not her name. She was still Mara, she was still counting. And as long as she was counting, she was still refusing. That refusal, quiet, private, invisible to everyone except the stone walls that held her, was the only rebellion available to her. It was also, though she didn't know it yet, enough. The work order reached the top of the queue on March 19th. A 2-man crew from the Municipal Water Authority, Georgos Papadimitriou, 54, and his apprentice, Nikos Fakianakis, 23, was dispatched to inspect the sealed cistern beneath Odos Chandakos, a narrow street in the old town that tourists walked daily without knowing what lay beneath their feet. They arrived at 9 in the morning with crowbars, flashlights, and a handheld gas detector. The access point was a rusted iron hatch set into the cobblestones, partially obscured by a dumpster that belonged to a souvlaki shop. It took them 20 minutes to move the dumpster and another 15 to pry the hatch open. The bolts were not original. Someone had replaced them recently. Georgos noticed this. He mentioned it to Nikos. Neither of them understood what it meant. The smell hit them first. Not decay. Something else. Human habitation. Sweat, urine, stale air, the unmistakable odor of a body living in a space without ventilation. Georgos had worked underground for 26 years. He'd smelled dead animals, sewage, chemical runoff, rot of every variety. He had never smelled this. Someone's down there, he said. Nikos thought he meant a homeless person, someone squatting in the cistern. It happens sometimes. Georgos didn't correct him. He didn't know what he meant. He only knew the smell was wrong. They descended the stone steps, 17 of them, worn smooth, curving to the left. The flashlight beams swept across walls that were damp and ancient, built from blocks of limestone fitted without mortar. The work of Venetian engineers who had designed this space to hold rainwater for a city that no longer remembered it existed. At the bottom of the steps, a padlocked iron door. Georgos stopped. The padlock was new. Brass, heavy duty, the kind you'd buy at a hardware store. It had no business being on a door in a sealed municipal cistern. We should call someone, Nikos said. Georgos was already cutting the lock with the bolt cutters he carried for exactly this kind of obstruction. It took 3 attempts. The lock fell. The door swung inward and the smell intensified, thick, warm, alive. The chamber was roughly 4 meters by 5. The ceiling was low, barely 2 meters, and curved like the inside of a barrel. The floor was stone, covered in a thin layer of grit. Against the far wall, a wooden chair, a plastic bucket, a tray with a plate of food that looked untouched. Bread, olives, a bottle of water. A battery-powered lantern switched off. A pile of fabric in the corner that might have been blankets. And sitting on the floor, pressed into the corner with her knees drawn to her chest, a woman in a white dress. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She looked at them with eyes that had adapted to near-total darkness and were now overwhelmed by flashlight beams. She raised one hand, slowly, as if the gesture cost her something, and shielded her face. Georgos lowered the flashlight. He crouched. He spoke softly in Greek. "We're from the Water Authority," he said, because it was true and because he didn't know what else to say. "We're not going to hurt you. Can you tell me your name?" The woman's lips moved. No sound came out. She tried again. "Mara," she said. Her voice was a rasp, barely audible, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat. "My name is Mara." Nikos was already calling the police. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped his phone on the stone steps and had to retrieve it. Georgos stayed where he was, crouched in the doorway, keeping his distance, keeping the light low, talking to the woman in the white dress in a voice his own children would not have recognized. Tender, careful, as if she were made of something that might shatter. "You're safe," he said. "We found you. You're safe." She looked at him. Her expression was unreadable. Not relief, not gratitude, not anything he had a word for. She looked at him the way someone looks at an impossible thing, a thing that exists outside the framework they've been surviving inside. "What day is it?" she asked. "March 19th, Georgos said. She closed her eyes. Her lips moved, counting something, days, months, breaths. Then she opened her eyes and said in English, in a voice that was steady and broken at the same time, "I was married, in July, on Santorini. My husband's name is Daniel Voss. He did this to me." She was taken to Venizelio Hospital in Heraklion. She weighed 41 kilograms. She'd lost nearly a third of her body weight. She was severely dehydrated, anemic, and suffering from vitamin deficiencies that had begun to affect her vision and her nervous system. Her muscles had atrophied. The bones in her feet had developed stress fractures from pacing on stone. Her skin, deprived of sunlight for 8 months, was translucent, the veins visible beneath it like a map of everything that had kept her alive. The white dress she was wearing was not her wedding dress. Her wedding dress, a simple sheath she'd bought in a second-hand shop in Copenhagen because she'd thought spending thousands on a dress you wore once was absurd, had been left in the hotel room on Santorini. This dress was different, formal, expensive, a long-sleeved gown with lace detailing and a high collar, and the kind of dress you'd see in a bridal magazine, not on a woman in a cistern. It was clean. Someone had laundered it recently. It fit her poorly. It had been made for a larger woman, and Mara's diminished frame swam inside it. She told investigators she'd woken wearing it approximately 3 months into her captivity. She'd gone to sleep in the clothes she'd been taken in, a cotton nightgown she'd worn in the hotel bathroom, and woken in this dress. Someone had changed her clothing while she was unconscious. She did not know how she'd been sedated. She suspected the water. The dress had a tag, Italian. The brand was a mid-range bridal designer based in Milan. Investigators traced the specific gown to a boutique in Athens that had sold it in September of 2023, 2 months after Mara's disappearance, to a man who paid cash and gave a name that matched no identification records in Greece. The boutique owner remembered him. Middle-aged, well-dressed, polite. He'd known the exact measurements he wanted, she said, though the measurements hadn't quite matched the woman who would eventually wear the dress. He said it was for his fiancée, the owner told police. He said she couldn't come to the fitting because she was traveling. She paused. He seemed happy, she added, like a man planning a wedding. The investigation that followed Mara's rescue unfolded across 4 countries and took 11 months to complete. Its findings were partial, its conclusions incomplete, and its central figure, Daniel Voss, remained elusive in ways that suggested not flight but infrastructure. He hadn't disappeared. He'd retracted, like a limb drawn back into a body too large and too diffuse to fully apprehend. Daniel Voss was not an architect. He was not, in any meaningful sense, Swedish-American. He held passports from 3 countries under 3 names, none of which appeared to be his original identity. The Copenhagen apartment had been leased through a shell company registered in Estonia. His architectural credentials were fabricated, convincingly, professionally, expensively fabricated. Someone had built him a life the way you'd build a set for a film, detailed enough to withstand casual inspection, hollow behind the facade. Europol issued a red notice in April. Greek police coordinated with Interpol, Moldovan authorities, and Danish intelligence. They traced financial connections to a network that operated across southeastern Europe, a network involved in what investigators carefully described as the acquisition, transport, and private placement of vulnerable persons. The language was clinical. The reality was not. Mr. Kyrios Nikos, was arrested in Heraklion in May. His real name was Nikolaos Frangakis, 61, a former real estate developer with gambling debts and connections to organized crime networks operating in the Aegean. He was the logistical manager, the person who maintained the physical infrastructure, hired the guards, arranged the supplies. He was not the architect of Mara's captivity. He was the contractor. The architect was Daniel Voss, or whoever Daniel Voss had been before he became Daniel Voss. Petros Manoudakis was arrested, then turned state's witness. He provided testimony that corroborated Mara's account and filled in gaps she couldn't. The supply schedule, the phone numbers, the chain of communication. He described bringing her food twice a day, described her voice in the dark, described the moment she told him about her sister, and he sat in his car unable to breathe. His testimony was essential to the prosecution. His culpability was undeniable. Both things were true simultaneously, and the court struggled with the mathematics of guilt and cooperation in a way that satisfied no one. He received a reduced sentence of 6 years. Mara was not consulted about the deal. When she learned of it, she said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "He brought me food every day, and every day he locked the door behind him." She paused, but he set the tray down gently. I heard him. He was careful not to startle me. She didn't say whether this mattered. The question of whether small kindnesses within a system of absolute cruelty constitute something, mercy, complicity, humanity, cowardice, is not a question with an answer. It is a question you carry. Daniel Voss was arrested in Bucharest in August of 2024, 13 months after Mara walked into a bathroom in Santorini and someone else walked her out through a service corridor, down a maintenance stairway, into a vehicle idling in the staff parking area of a hotel whose security cameras had been redirected by a night porter who owed money to people who knew the man called Kyrios Nikos. He was extradited to Greece. He stood trial in Heraklion. He said nothing, not in court, not to investigators, not to the press. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty on all charges and mounted a defense built on procedural challenges and evidentiary disputes. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. He was convicted on charges of kidnapping, human trafficking, and unlawful imprisonment. He was sentenced to 23 years. He showed no reaction. He looked, one journalist wrote, like a man waiting for a delayed flight. Bored, patient, certain he'd eventually reach his destination. He is appealing. He will likely appeal for years. The system allows it. The system was not designed for men like Daniel Voss. Mara Voss returned to Moldova. She moved back to Florești, into her parents' apartment with the clanking radiators and the windows that don't seal. She sleeps in her childhood bedroom. Her cat, kept alive by her mother for 8 months on faith alone, sleeps on her feet. She doesn't teach anymore. She tried briefly, returned to the language center, stood in front of a class, opened her mouth to say, "Tell me about your morning," and couldn't continue. She excused herself. She went to the bathroom. She couldn't bring herself to close the door. She sees a therapist in Chisinau, a 2-hour bus ride each way. She takes the early bus and the late one home. She reads during the journey, novels mostly, in all 4 of her languages, rotating between them the way she once rotated between lives, between identities, between the woman she was in Moldova and the woman Daniel Voss had made her believe she could become. Alina visits every weekend. They don't talk about the cistern. They talk about the cat, about their mother's cooking, about a television series Alina is watching. They sit in the kitchen drinking tea that's too sweet, And sometimes the silence between them fills with something that isn't quite peace, but isn't quite absence either. Something growing slowly, the way things grow in soil that's been scorched. Her mother watches her. The same careful attention she once directed at Daniel Voss, like a stone in a river, no edges, now directed at her daughter, searching for signs of something she can't name. Damage, perhaps? Or recovery? Or the precise place where one ends and the other begins, if such a border exists. In a video deposition recorded for the trial, Mara was asked to describe what she remembered most clearly from her captivity. Not the worst moment, not the most frightening, the most clear. She thought for a long time. The dress, she said, waking up in the dress. Because everything else, the dark, the hunger, the fear, I could survive those. I was surviving them. But the dress meant someone had touched me while I was unconscious. Someone had made a decision about my body, about what I would wear, about what I would be. Someone had dressed me for a ceremony I hadn't agreed to, in a role I hadn't chosen, and when I woke up I was already inside it. She touched the collar of her shirt, an ordinary shirt, cotton, chosen by her. That's what I count against, she said. Not the dark, the dress, the fact that someone decided who I was while I was sleeping. She looked at the camera, her eyes were steady. I never agreed, she said. I want that recorded. Whatever else happened, whatever they took, whatever they did, I never agreed to any of it. Not the second dress, not the room, not the name they planned to give me. She paused. Not even the first dress, really. Not the wedding. Not the man I thought I married. None of it was what I was told it was, but the first time I didn't know. The second time I knew. And I refused. She straightened in her chair, and for a moment she looked like the woman in the restaurant photograph. Alive, completely alive, refusing to be diminished by the world's capacity for cruelty. I'm still refusing, she said. The deposition ended. The camera kept recording for another 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, Mara Voss sat perfectly still, looking at something beyond the lens, beyond the room, beyond the reach of anyone who would try to tell her story as though it were finished. It isn't finished. She's still counting.